Want to know what Europe does for you? Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on the fight against terrorism.
Madrid, London, Paris, Brussels. Since the turn of the century, terrorism has shaken Europe to its very core.
Faced with a growing international terrorist threat, the EU and its member states have bolstered their capabilities to prevent and combat terrorism and make Europe safer. But work is not over yet. Stay with us.
Terrorism is not a new phenomenon in Europe, but since the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington, it has evolved from mostly domestic concerns to a more global scale and claimed the lives of 753 people in 15 EU countries between 2000 and 2018.
In 2017 alone, there were 205 failed, foiled or completed terrorist attacks in the EU, and more than 1,200 people were arrested for terrorist offences in the same year. So even though law enforcement agencies are having much success in combating terrorism, there's more to be done.
The unprecedented wave of terrorist plots that hit Europe between 2015 and 2018, most of them inspired by jihadist ideology, pose significant challenges for the EU and its member states. What should be done with the hundreds of young Europeans who left for Syria and Iraq to join the ranks of ISIL-Daesh? And how can we deal with the threat posed by the possible return of these foreign fighters to Europe, perhaps with the intention to kill here?
How can we deal with lone wolves and prevent homegrown terrorism and radicalisation, in particular online? How do we cut terrorists' access to firearms, explosives and the necessary funding to plot their atrocities? But also, how should we deal with the victims of terrorism, better secure Europe's borders and ensure that the fundamental rights of EU citizens are not compromised?
Responding to these multiple and evolving challenges is something no member state can do on its own. That's where the EU steps in. But what are its competences in this field?
Even though primary responsibility in the fight against terrorism lies with the member states, the EU provides cooperation, coordination, to some extent, harmonisation tools and financial support to address the cross-border nature of this threat.
The first piece of EU legislation in this field, the Framework Decision on Combating Terrorism, was adopted in 2002 and, amongst other things, provided a common definition of terrorist offences across Europe.
Following the Madrid and London attacks in the early 2000s, the EU adopted a counter-terrorism strategy based on four main pillars: prevention, protection, pursuit and response. It also appointed a counter-terrorism coordinator and stepped up its international cooperation in this area.
Because a global threat requires global action, the EU cooperates with international organisations such as the UN and its agencies and various global coalitions against terrorism and against ISIL-Daesh in particular. It also cooperates bilaterally with third countries, including with the United States, its main partner in the field of counter-terrorism.
And how much does the EU spend in the fight against terrorism?
Counter-terrorism strategies are mainly implemented at national level, so it's difficult to give a precise figure on how much the EU is spending in this field. It's clear, however, that EU funding has risen over the years and will continue to do so in the future to allow for better cooperation between national law enforcement authorities and enhanced support by the EU bodies in charge of security, such as Europol.
The main EU instrument to provide financial support to member states' initiatives to combat crime and terrorism is the Internal Security Fund, but the Union also allocates resources from other funds to prevention and research projects in this field.
So what has the EU achieved in this field over the past 5 years? Stay with us.
Since 2014, the EU has taken a whole range of measures to prevent and combat terrorism, as well as to build resilience against attacks. It has updated its legislation on combating terrorism to criminalise a wide range of terrorist activities such as cyber-terrorism, travelling abroad to take part in terrorist activities and receiving terrorist training, and has adopted new provisions to improve assistance to victims of terrorism.
It has also adopted new laws to sever terrorism's financial lifeline, tightened control around firearms and explosives, strengthened the protection of external borders, and increased information exchange between national law enforcement authorities as well as with EU agencies.
For example, in April 2016, the EU decided to establish a new system to collect flight passenger data in order to detect suspicious travel and counter the foreign fighter phenomenon. And just this year, it upgraded the system for the exchange of criminal records in Europe, creating a new database covering non-EU nationals.
Important steps have also been taken to increase the Union's resilience to cyber attacks and to upgrade the powers and means of agencies involved in the fight against terrorism, such as Europol, Eurojust and Frontex.
To prevent homegrown terrorism, the EU set up a radicalisation awareness network which brings together more than 3,000 police officers, prison authorities, teachers, youth workers and civil society representatives in an effort to address the root causes of radicalisation.
In recent years, the EU has also stepped up international cooperation in this area, increasing information exchange with third countries and intensifying counter-terrorism capacity building efforts, as well as cooperation with the US.
To ensure that increased security does not hamper the fundamental rights and freedoms of EU citizens, the EU also strengthens its data protection rules.
So how is the EU counter-terrorism policy likely to develop in the future? Stay with us.
Most probably, counterterrorism will continue to feature high on the EU's agenda in the future. The EU and its member states now have more instruments and means to fight terrorism, but how efficient are they?
To evaluate the efficiency of the existing tools and identify gaps and possible ways forward, the European Parliament set up a special committee on terrorism in 2017, which made recommendations for both short and longer-term action aimed at better preventing terrorism, combating its root causes, protecting EU citizens, and assisting victims in the best possible way.
In line with these recommendations, future EU counter-terrorism action will most likely focus on addressing current and new threats, countering radicalisation, including online, and protecting critical infrastructure.
EU efforts are also likely to focus on increased information sharing and better interoperability between EU security and border-related databases. The EU is also considering whether to increase the powers of the recently established European Public Prosecutor's Office to enable it to investigate and prosecute terrorist crimes at EU level.
And aware that more security also means more money, the Commission has proposed to double the funding available under the Internal Security Fund in the future budget for the years 2021 to 2027.
We know citizens have high expectations of the EU in fighting terrorism, but will the efforts of the past few years to better arm the Union and its member states for that fight be enough?
You're listening to European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.